Before I get into the content of today's webinar, I want to first acknowledge the land on which I live as we gather for today's webinar. So where I sit are the ancestral homelands of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples, and it is where I am privileged to live, work, and play. So first things first, I want to introduce the 2024 Dues and Fees Committee. I believe most, if not all, are here with us this evening or afternoon, depending on where you're logging in from. So from the Atlantic region, we have Daphne Dumont. Daphne has been with the Dues and Fees Committee for several years. Daphne, thank you for all your years of volunteering. You often serve as you provide that sort of like committee history for anyone who's new to the committee, but also for the staff. And we appreciate everything that you've done and committed to the committee for the past couple of years. We have Judy and Audrey from BC. They're both new to the committee. We have Dave from Ontario, as well as Russ Hart from the Prairie region. Daphne Bisson, she is the chair, and she's from Quebec. She's a president of Montreal Rowing Club. From the RCA Board of Directors, Carol Purser is here. She's the president, and Derek Ventnor, the treasurer. Both are here as ex officio members of the committee. Typically, we have more senior staff involved in delivering the webinar. But this evening I'm wearing two hats. So I'm the director of sport and also I am the interim CEO. So for those of you who've been to this webinar before, you may hear me a bit more than what you were accustomed to. Okay, so tonight we're going to spend our time going over the mandate of the Dues and Fees Committee. We're also going to talk about the process that they followed. I'm going to get into some of the participant activity from the most recent fiscal year, as well as I'll do an overview of all of our funding and revenue sources, as well as I'll speak to how we use that funding in relation to the investment and the benefits that are offered to the community. Derek's going to take us through some of the finances, specifically the summary of operations. And Daphne's then going to present some of the discussion points and the considerations that the committee reviewed that ultimately lent into the recommendation that we've provided for the membership to discuss this evening. There's going to be plenty of time for questions and feedback. Most of the content this evening is going to be presented in English. We have a bit that's going to be presented in both English and French. Daphne Bisson, the chair, she is fully bilingual. So if you have questions, please use the chat and know that you can ask your question in the language of your preference. At the end of the session, there should be plenty of time to open it up if anybody wants to speak to anything. And I'll also get to any of the questions that we haven't addressed during the slides at that point also. If you have questions that come to you after the webinar, or you've had enough time, they've been lingering that you want to bring forward, please contact Daphne Bisson or Derek Ventnor. Their email addresses are there on the PowerPoint slide, but also I believe we provided them in the package that you all would have received prior to this evening. And I think one of the staff might be able to help plunk their contact information in the chat. So we are recording this evening for anybody who can't join us. And so do ask that you try to keep yourselves on mute so that we can limit the background noise. That's really helpful for the recording. And again, we will provide an opportunity for people to speak at the end of the webinar. There will be more information to come following this evening. So the recording will be posted to the website. The information package that you would have received also will be posted to the website if it's not already there. And then there'll be more details about the dues and fees that are offered to the membership that'll be part of the semi-annual meeting voting package. So let me just first take a peek to see if we have any questions yet in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing any. Okay, so let's get started. Derek, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. So just a quick overview of the mandate and the parameters of the work of the committee. So this committee is established actually through the Rowing Canada bylaws. And through this process, including the process we do tonight, the punchline is any recommendations by the committee, they are presented to the board of directors in December, but they actually are voted on and approved by the membership during the semi-annual meeting that will happen at the end of January. All of this is laid out in our bylaws and in the additional information that has been provided to you throughout this year's process. So we've gone through the last few weeks with the committee, 2 or 3 meetings going through different sets of information, and the committee has had the ability to go back to their own constituents to get kind of a gut check on where the membership was feeling. We've presented a lot of data on much of what we'll present this evening on what's being considered and what factors are considered as the committee works toward its recommendation. And as I said, what will happen is we'll take any feedback we get tonight. The committee will meet one more time prior to a early winter board meeting. The board of directors will be informed of the work of the committee, and then the final recommendations that the membership will be asked to vote on will be sent out at least 21 days prior to the semi-annual meeting, which is scheduled for the end of January 2025.
Okay. Thanks, Derek. I'm just seeing a question here in the chat. So when was the package sent out? I didn't get one. It was sent out yesterday morning to people who registered for the webinar, but if for some reason you didn't get it, Alethea here has offered to send her an email and she'll be able to forward that on to you. So if anyone else also didn't receive it, please email Alethea. Okay, Daphne, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir à tous. So a little bit of what the committee did process. So we did meet for the first time on October 8th. I've been elected at that first meeting. And during that first meeting, we went through some procedures, some timetable, and some information that we needed to know about the committee, of course. Then on October 27th, we met again. And then at that meeting, we went over and reviewed some portfolio financial information. We did go through a report of participant activity data and other relevant information for us to take into consideration for our recommendation. November 7th, we then met again and continue our discussion, and did end up formulate some recommendation that we'll have for you tonight. We are tonight, November 21st, and we're here to hear your feedback about our recommendation to the board that we'll send in the few days. And we'll meet back on January 25th for the pre-semi-annual meeting plenary to discuss before the vote that will happen during that weekend.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. So what often comes up as part of the dues and fees committee process are topics that are certainly related to the dues and fees, but they don't actually fall within the mandate of what the dues and fees committee is going to speak to. So I want to take a moment just to overview specifically what are the fees that we're discussing this evening. And that's not to say that we can't talk, have a little bit of scope sway and talk about a few other things this evening. But it is really important to understand what are the fees that we're really getting into and that the committee spent time discussing, because ultimately that's what the membership is going to be voting on in January. So specifically, there's 3 different sets of dues. So there's the provincial rowing associations, and then there's special associations and associate organizations, and then there's rowing clubs. And then added to that, we also discuss fees. So there's participant fees and seat fees. So Rowing Canada has a lot of different other types of fees that many of you would be familiar with. So for instance, there's like the conference fee. We have a Come Try Rowing fee. We charge fees for coaching workshops. Those are just some examples. Those don't fall within the oversight of the dues and fees committee. So that's why we don't spend time discussing what those fees are. So we also here included, just to get you oriented, or a reminder of what the fees are for this current fiscal year, okay, for 24-25. Okay, so I appreciate there's a lot of information on the slide, so let me walk you through and get you oriented on what we're going to discuss. So over here, we have 3 rows. The first one is registered participants, or, more colloquially thought of as like the rowers, okay? The people who actually sign up and become a participant at your club and a PRA and with Rowing Canada. And then of those participants, the competitors are those that attend an event or a regatta. And so even if they attend just one event, they're considered a competitor in the scope of what I'm going to speak to on this slide. And then the regattas are the sanctioned events that occurred across the Canadian rowing community for the year. Okay. So this first column here is related to 2019 and 2020, their actual numbers. This is our last year that we consider truly like a pre-pandemic number. And so we do find sometimes we're doing a comparison to that year. And we did for the purpose of the discussion this evening also. I'm sure we all look forward to a time when we're not still talking about pre and post pandemic, but we thought there was some value in presenting that here for you tonight. Really what we're getting into tonight, though, is the 23-24 actuals. And again, when we do comparisons, we always like to look at the previous fiscal year, which is why you see 22-23 here. Okay, but we're going to focus most of our conversation and a lot of the data that we present today is around 23-24. It's the last full fiscal year. So as far as registered participants go, we have 12,294, which exceeds both what we had pre-pandemic as well as within the previous fiscal year. So this is a good sign. And specifically, we're seeing that we have over 600 more individuals were registered as a rower in the 23-24 year compared to the year prior to that. And one thing I will say, though, is when we do an assessment of trends, we typically like to look at a few years of data before we draw any like real firm conclusions. So usually it's around 3 years that we start to identify if there's a trend, and that can go plus or minus, right? If we're seeing a downward trend that's beyond 3 years, that's when it starts to feel a bit troubling. And then also if we see a positive trend, like an increase in numbers of people who row, really we want to like see that for several years in a row before we get too excited, because as all of us know, just with the size of the clubs and how like the size of the community, sometimes you can see a difference of 600 people because you had 1 or 2 clubs that had like a really great or special year. And then sometimes we see a decrease because 1 or 2 clubs, maybe they lost their champion volunteer, right? It could be a coach that was really like upholding a lot of the programs that's no longer at that club, or sometimes some of our clubs deal with some like natural disaster, flooding type scenarios or wildfires that can have an impact on their registration numbers that's pretty significant, and then obviously has an effect on the national numbers. Okay. So, but if you're looking for a good news story, what I will say is that for the past couple of years now post-pandemic is that we have seen a subtle increase year on year. With competitors, we had 5,181 individuals who chose to compete, and that's of the 12,294. And actually, we're seeing a decrease when we do a comparison against 22-23 of individuals who have chosen to compete. And you also see that in regattas, there was actually 1 fewer regatta hosted in 23-24 compared to the prior year. And so maybe that had a subtle influence on that. But this is something we'll definitely keep an eye on over the next couple of years. Again, like I mentioned earlier, if we were to see this consistently over at least 3 years, that would definitely raise a flag for us. And so really to summarize, so if you want to get into percentages, we've seen just over a 5% increase in registered participants in the most recent fiscal compared to previous. And then we've seen just shy of a 10% decrease in the number of individuals who competed when we compare to the previous fiscal. One thing I'll note that's not on the slide, but I believe was included in your package, is that of the individuals who choose to compete, that while they are at a regatta, they're choosing to compete more frequently than what we've seen in the past. And so that's just a data point that some of you may find interesting. Another piece that we like to look at is where are we at 6 months in to the registration year. So looking at the first 6 months, so that takes us to September 30th, 2024. So just 2 months ago, we were at 11,680 participants who are registered. And when we compare that to the previous fiscal, we see it's an increase of 400. Okay. Most of our registrations, I don't have the percentage in front of me, but we do see the bulk of registrations occur in the first 3 quarters of the fiscal year. And so this tends to give us a good sense of where things are heading for the full fiscal year. Okay, so the purpose of this slide is not to give you a headache, but it's an opportunity for me to give you a run through of some of our major sources of funding and revenue, and possibly address some of the demystify some of the myths that are out there that we know exist around where does Rowing Canada's funding come from. I don't get too deep into the actual values there, but we certainly have time to do so if that's of interest to you. So just flag it for me if I gloss over anything that you would prefer that we really get into here. So first things first, though, I am going to say that this is representative, this total RCA income for 24-25 year of what was budgeted. Okay, this reflects like the original approved budget. And I share that because, you know, as we go through the year, we update with projections, things certainly change. And a really good example of that would be a 0 here for the CPC. So the CPC is the Canadian Paralympic Committee. When we first presented this budget and it went forward to approval, we were anticipating no dollars from the Canadian Paralympic Committee. But as everyone knows, Jacob qualified for the Paralympics. And so as a result, we actually did end up with a bump there that will likely show up in the projection. I don't know if it'll show up in that level of detail with what Derek is presenting, but really this is for me to explain that this is what was budgeted based on what we knew at the time, but things definitely fluctuate throughout the fiscal year. Ultimately, one of the biggest takeaways from this slide is the amount of funding that we get from government partners, and specifically Sport Canada. So we receive over $4 million from Sport Canada, and that is divided up into different envelopes. So every national sport federation that is recognized by Sport Canada is eligible for reference level funding. My cursor's Oh, there it goes. Hopefully you can see my cursor there. So it's $1.4 million that Rowing Canada is the recipient of reference level funding. Now, reference level is also more colloquially known as like core funding. And I believe it's referred to that because, or is referred as that because there's a little bit of flexibility that you can apply with that reference level funding. It's meant to support core operations, so for a national sport federation. And so there is an expectation that your reference level funding, that an NSO will allocate some of it to high performance programming, which we have here. And then the rest of it can go towards what we call national sport development and operations. You can also think of that as like domestic, right? So the community and also the corporate function of the organization. Like how is Rowing Canada keeping the lights on? Okay. And then periodically, Sport Canada will offer what's called above reference level funding. And it usually comes with some specificity to it, right? It's this particular funding envelope. It's related to something that's important for the within the government. And so one example is policy and governance. And so we're anticipating about $30,000 from Sport Canada for above reference level funding to work on some policy and governance work. And previously, you would have seen something like the Safe Sport funding come through as above reference level. A lot of our funding comes from Own the Podium. That's what this acronym here, OTP, is representing. And that's part of the Enhanced Excellence funding. It's still from Sport Canada, but Own the Podium is the performance partner that is responsible for assessing which targeted sports get funding and also how much funding we get on an annual basis. One thing that I think is important to note here is that we don't enhance excellence is either you get it or you don't. Okay. So we are very fortunate that we do get access to this enhanced excellence funding and can put it towards our high performance program. But it's not something that accessing enhanced excellence and putting it to high performance and not being able to put it somewhere else is a bit of a myth. I think I've heard from some people. Basically, you get it or you don't. We don't have a decision to actually take enhanced excellence funding and use it, like repurpose it for something else. Okay. Something else that I wanted to point out here is that the Canadian Olympic Committee is sometimes known as being exclusively focused on high performance. And you can see here, if you follow the line, that we do certainly benefit from funding from the Canadian Olympic Committee that goes into high performance programs and operations. But additionally, periodically, the COC will offer funding in the form of what's called National Sport Federation Enhancement Funding. And that is usually offered over a 2-year period. And it often comes with some specific requirements or a directive on like what areas it could be spent on. But ultimately, I would characterize it as funding that's really meant to like elevate national sport federations with your corporate services, or if you want to pilot something or try a new project. There's tends to be a bit more flexibility with that kind of funding. And we benefited from that from over several years. You can see this fiscal, we have around 40K that goes towards the non-high performance arm of the organization, so the corporate function. Something else here that is different that I wanted to highlight for you is the hosting grants. So we don't typically have $500,000 for hosting. This is specifically related to the funding that it was like flow through for World Rowing Championships that were hosted in St. Catharines this past year. So that's where that's coming from. And then finally, it's important to note that the membership dues and fees, it's $600,000 that goes towards national sport dev and operations. This works out to about 30% of the whole bucket that goes into national sport dev and ops. And I know that, 30% depends who you talk to, that it's not high, it's not over 50%, right? But it still is a significant amount of funding that goes into the national sport development operations. So I really want to emphasize that, because the membership dues and fees that we do collect, even though it's not to the tune of what we get from the government, it still is incredibly valuable. So I'm actually going to get into that in a moment. Okay, so I won't review everything on this chart. I know this probably looks really familiar to those of you who've been to this webinar before. Let me just pick a box to focus on. Okay, so this is exclusively what goes into the domestic arm of the organization. So we're not talking about high performance here. So governance, as an example, $68,000, that goes to items such as paying for the semi-annual meeting, the venue. So sometimes that's in person, sometimes it's virtual. There's still a cost that comes with that, particularly if you have an online voting system. If we convene certain committees and PAC meetings, that's where that funding would go to, as well as if when the board meets. We also have some governance support and legal fees that we would put to this bucket. That's different from, though, say if we did some safe sport work that required some legal support for policies, we would actually put that over here in the safe sport bucket, just as an example. We also have several association fees. So for instance, when we pay to be a member of World Rowing, it would be categorized as governance here. So that's just one example. Community Sport for All is highlighted yellow for good reason. So in April, when the government presented the budget, they did at that time say that there was going to be $15 million available for a Community Sport for All initiative. But we were advised back then that it would take many months before we would see how that would unfold. And so when we were designing preparing for the webinar and doing the work with the Dues and Fees Committee, we still had some question marks related to what that program is going to look like. Great news. Last week, we heard that the National Sport Federations are eligible to apply for this funding. We will be submitting our application before the deadline, which is just before the holidays. And so we don't know yet what this will look like, but hopefully we will find out maybe February or March as to how much funding we will have access, which means that the community will be able to then apply for grants similar to what you have been doing over the past couple of years. So, okay. I'm seeing some questions here in the chat, so let me see if I can address. Okay. Jen, you mentioned that athletes that are competing more frequently. What is a year-on-year change in seat fees? 10% or less? Thank you. Okay. Oh, thank you, Alethea. Alethea responded. Overall seats had an increase of approximately 16%. And actually, Tracy, that's not, that's just in comparison to the previous fiscal, that 16%. We haven't seen this kind of trend, or at least not that dramatically, over several years. So there's definitely more to unpack with that. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions that you want to plunk into the chat now before I move to the next slide? Okay, and that's okay. We can always come back. Okay, Derek, over to you.
Okay, Jen, if you could, yes, adjust for my aged eyes. Folks, okay, that's good for a moment. Thank you. What we have in front of you, folks, is a summary statement of operations for this, and there's 3 sets of data that you'll see in these 3 columns. So we have the actual financial performance from April to September of 2025 or 2024. I beg your pardon. The first 6 months of our fiscal year. So we're halfway through the year. We've gone ahead and done some projections on where we believe we're going to end up in each of these lines come March 31st. Now, there will be some variation to this inevitably between now and the end of March over the 6-month period. But working with the team, we feel we're in a position where we can make reasonably accurate projections now, which is a nice spot to be. And then we've also got the comparative to budget, the approved budget that the board approved last spring for the current fiscal. Again, we're talking current fiscal. We're 6 months in with September 30th, ends March 31st, 2025. So as you can see right now, we're by and large, are feeling very good that we're being on track. Number one, with how we're tracking this year compared to our budget, what we budgeted. If you'll scroll down just a bit, I'm not going to go line by line. We're going to do a little more bit of a dive on the membership fees actually in the next slide or two. But I did want to give the membership an overall feel of where we actually are. And what this is, I don't think in the past, or certainly not every year, we've had the numbers up to date to this point in time for this webinar. So we've worked pretty hard to try and get things up to speed and reconciled up until the end of September. I beg your pardon. So right now you can see where we've budgeted. We're pretty much on track for year end. You can see the projection for the year end versus the budget. So the projection versus budget, the budget is the column on the far right. And we just wanted to give an indication that things are tracking better. Things have been managed very, very well as far to try to keep an eye on the prize on how things are flowing. There's no massive variations in any one of the areas, which is good news. And this gives us a better sense of what we feel is reasonable as we're working with the Dues and Fees Committee to come up with a recommendation for the membership to consider based on accurate, recent, real numbers, as opposed to the audited numbers that would now be 6, 7, 8 months old, and so on and so forth. How does this compare to last year? Frankly, Debbie, I don't have those numbers. I don't have the September 30th, 2023 numbers versus 2024. So I'm sorry, I can't speak to that. I don't have that information at hand. I simply don't recall. Sorry about that.
I will say though, Derek, just because it was an Olympic and Paralympic year, that there would be more material variation.
Fair enough. I don't want to speak to anything I don't have in front of me. Some of us have had to learn the hard way not to do that. Are there any other questions? I went this very fast. I just wanted to give the folks an overview of where we are and how we're trending and to give some sense of confidence that we are very much on budget to what the board has approved and we're managing things as tight as we can. Are there any other questions at this point before we move on to the next slide? Okay, go ahead.
Daphne.
This is Daphne. Yeah.
Exactly. So you just got presented part of what the committee did look at and what we discussed. And of course, Derek and Jen was there to answer most of our question, well, all of our question, of course. So here's a quick resume of what the committee want to tell you and see how we saw that before we're presenting a recommendation. Dues and fees, as Jennifer just showed in the graph, contribute a small but really important fraction of the funding for services provided to the member and the participants. I think we need as member group to contribute to that. And I think we need to be proud of what we contribute for and be okay with what happened with the rest of the funding. we end up knowing that RCA has increasing costs and limited revenues. Of course, there's a financial pressure that has been felt for the last several months at all levels, and we conclude that real costs have increased much more than just the annual rate of inflation. As you know, and as you all been seeing, traveling, accommodation go way higher than what the CPI is currently. And we do recognize that for RCA, but also the committee did discuss that those same costs are felt by the entire membership, and though the membership feel the same pressure. And now I'm gonna do that slide in French. Alors, pour nos collègues francophones, francophiles, un petit résumé de ce que notre comité a donc discuté. Vous avez vu avec Jen et Derek les rapports présentés, beaucoup de rapports financiers. C'est une partie de ce que le comité a discuté, une partie de ce que le comité a évalué. Nos conversations ont été plus larges et beaucoup de nos questions, toutes nos questions en fait, ont été répondues par Derek et Jennifer. Le comité voulait donc mettre en valeur le fait que les cotisations et les frais fournis par les membres financent une petite partie, mais une importante portion, donc des services qui sont fournis aux membres et aux participants. Je pense qu'il faut être fier de pouvoir contribuer à cet essor, puis contribuer du reste du financement au passage. Le comité a voulu mettre en valeur qu'il y a une présence de pression financière, qui est apportée par l'économie actuelle. Cette pression financière affecte RCA. Donc, on peut penser à tous les coûts de transport, d'hébergement qui sont en hausse pour tout le monde et qui affectent donc les coûts de RCA, mais qui sont aussi en rapport avec les revenus limités qui sont en ce moment. Le comité a aussi pris en considération que tous ces frais, toute cette économie qui a une pression financière affecte aussi les membres. Donc, vous aussi, dans vos clubs, dans vos communautés, vous vivez les mêmes effets de cette pression financière. C'est donc important qu'on le prenne en considération avant de faire nos recommandations.
Okay, thanks for that, Daphne. Something I also want to mention before Derek gets into, I think maybe some modeling on what the committee looked at, just related to RCA's increased costs and limited revenues, that we also have put in place some cost mitigation. And actually some of this corresponds with one of the questions in the chat here, which is a few months ago that you reported a 13% decrease in HP funding for this fiscal. Yes. And so the answer is yes. It was actually 14%, I believe. We did see a reduction in funding there. So we've taken several measures to try to right size the budget and deal with the sort of, the financial situation that we're in, the pressures that we're experiencing. So just a few examples. We have, from a staffing perspective, so over many months now, depending on the role, but if someone leaves, they find another opportunity or they retire, often we've made the tough decision to not actually replace or bring someone in to fill that role. Additionally, we've looked at some full-time roles and we've had to transition them to part-time. And then also, unfortunately, we've had to say goodbye to some of our colleagues. We've had to terminate some of the roles. And so that really was an effort to right-size the budget. We think that the pressures that we're experiencing this year are expected to go on in subsequent years, at least in the short term. So to Derek's point, like we have done a lot to sort of, to prepare ourselves for the future in that, from that perspective. Additionally, we've looked at our costs related to meetings and in-person travel. That affects not just the people who work for Roaring Canada, but also the volunteers. We don't meet in person as frequently. So for instance, the board hasn't met in person yet this fiscal. Just as one example, we have turned our committee meetings into virtual. And then this year, another effort is we have what is typically the in-person conference. We're delivering that with the virtual model this year. So we look forward to the time where we can get back to more in-person connection. We definitely value that and understand how important it is for an organization like ours, especially nationwide. We want to be able to connect with people from coast to coast to coast. And I do think that we'll get there at some point, but this was definitely something that we felt quite strongly that we had to put in place for this fiscal. Okay. Another question here, I'll address this before we get to the next slide. Without the 500K from hosting grant, should we expect a large increase next year to fees? So we are going to get into the recommendation of fees. We're getting there, just probably a few more slides. But then I also want to note that the 500K was an in and an out. Okay, Rowing Canada, we didn't use any of that funding. Okay, so it was really just a flow through, which is pretty common for the international sport events hosting program through Sport Canada. So we were the recipient of the funds, and then we would give it to St. Catharines World Rowing. Okay. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Eric, you're on mute.
Eric, are you on mute?
I'm not now.
Okay.
All right. There's a couple, one extra point I want to make before I dive into this slide, or couple, I guess. Just also keep in mind the following, that going back, we won't go back to the slide, but referring to the slide that Jen showed just a few minutes ago on how the funding is directed into different areas and where those sources of funding are coming from. Our projected membership fees revenue, memberships and dues revenue for this year, you may recall from that slide, is about, and the package is about just over $619,000. That represents only 30% of our total investment just on the domestic and governments and national operations side. And it's actually only 9% of our overall budget. Now, those are important to know for a lot of reasons. And as we've said previously, and I'll remind the group, we do not direct any of the membership fees and dues into HP. It's all of that funding is directed to sport operations. However, it's important to note as we get into the next piece of the discussion, as Jennifer has mentioned, our core funding has been flat for the better part of 20 years now. Very important to note that, and we're only at 30% that the membership fees actually support the costs of just the operations of the organization. Now, what we did with the Dues and Fees Committee, this sheet that you see in front of you, is we've done some very basic math on what certain percentage increases would actually mean in real dollars going forward, depending on what we were to present and what is eventually voted on by the membership. So you'll see on the far left side, the baseline for 24-25, based on the data we had, was 128 registered clubs. These are your base factors, the number of special associations, and so on. We've rounded is the projection of the number of participants registered is at the 12.5. And we've predicted or projected based on the data and what we expect between now and the end of March, 47,000 in seat fees. So that's seats entered in events. That's really important to understand. We've got the current year math. So as you can tell, there's a minor variance on what we had in the projection of that other slide and what we've calculated here. But then what we've done is tried to show in a very clear way, if we add X percent, what is the actual cash value of that? What is the real change? Because X percent might sound more than what real dollar change is when your base dollars is not all that much, relatively speaking. So, for example, as we go through these columns, you can see a 5% increase over current year fees would then result in these factors, the 483, the 603, and so on. But the net change in revenue would only be approximately $30,000. Um, on, that's not a lot of money on an over $2 million just domestic budget, nothing to do with HP. So we've done that through 5, 6, 7. The original charts went out to 10 or 11%, knowing that, a recommendation of a double digit percentage increase probably wouldn't be supported, and understandably so, when it come to a membership vote. But at the same time, it's very important for the committee and then the membership to understand what real dollars are involved with any X percentage change in membership fees. There was some discussion at the committee level as well. Well, what if we raise fee number 1 by 15%, but fee number 3, we keep it to 2%? What are the various variables? And after a lot of discussion, we decided that we weren't going to go that way, because then you're getting into never-ending math to try and figure, well, okay, what's the balance that is acceptable across the board? So we've taken the approach that we're going to recommend X% to everything right across. That's where the committee landed. And as you can see, we're given all the considerations that we've talked about, not just CPI, but the really very real matter of fact is that real costs in a lot of ways have increased much more than that. You're experiencing that in your clubs, just like we're experiencing at the provincial and national levels. So when you look at what the net change would be in revenue, the committee is recommending, based on all these considerations, approximately a 7% increase. So for the real math nerds out there, I covered ourselves by saying approximately to try and get us to round numbers. If it was exactly 7% on some of these numbers, it'd be really weird fees. So we've simplified them like we did last year, kind of rounded for accounting and administrative purposes. So the changes, if the membership were to accept this 7% increase, these results would be what would be proposed and voted on in January. So the club membership fee to $490 and down the list. All right. And you can see directly above what the deltas are. So the seat fee would go from $4 to $430. The participant registration from $27.50 to $29.40, and so on, and so on, and so on. So we just wanted to give a picture that we've actually done some pretty basic but core math to show what the real net delta change is on any given percent. So there's a few questions in the chat. Jen, I'll stop there and I'll answer what you'd like, but I'll let you manage the chat.
Okay, for sure. Okay. Is the OTP monies guaranteed? So no, it is a competitive process, but we are categorized as a targeted excellence sport. Typically, we have agreements with OTP that span the course of like 4 years, and within those contribution agreements, there's always a bit of wiggle room. So I wouldn't characterize as guaranteed per se, but I do think it would be bizarre if we weren't able to access, or if we weren't successful in accessing some of the podium funding. The next question is, does any of the high performance funding go towards governance, which would also oversee high performance? Okay, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, so high performance would have their own legal budget, for example. So in that governance bucket that I was showing, there was like legal fees. That would be more for like the corporate function of the organization. If high performance needs to have selection documentation reviewed from council, just as an example, that would go out of the high performance legal budget, which I'm using legal and governance sort of interchangeably. So if I didn't answer that question, just send me a nudge in the chat and I'll see if I can do better. Is there data of membership dues compared to total sport funding in other sports? Not in a way that's been analyzed and presented to us. The system, one thing I'll say that I think most of us are aware of, but maybe not all, is that the actual structure of Rowing Canada, like our governance structure, which has PRAs as members of RCA and clubs also as members of RCA, or having like that local group of clubs and associations being able to have direct membership with the national governing body, is actually considered quite rare. So most sports have models that look more like the clubs or the local associations are members of the provincial and territorial associations. And then it is exclusively like the PTSOs that are then members of the national governing body. And so with that in mind, it's very challenging to do a bit of like an apples to apples comparison of how our membership dues and fees, like from the categories, actually align with other sports. So I do know that the COC and the government does have access to some of this data, but I've never seen it actually analyzed and presented back to us to answer that question that you've posed. So Derek, this one is particularly for you. Did your analysis take into account any loss of membership if fee increases scare members away from rowing?
Short answer is no. No.
Okay. Okay, then there's just some comments here. The actual increase in past 2 years is 15.6% for associations, 12% for participants, 17.7% for clubs. It is a lot. I don't know if that is specific to Rowing Canada fees or if that's combining club or provincial fees also, but maybe we can go back to that. Thank you for that comment. Okay, next one. Any consideration of club fees based on club size? Smaller clubs are getting an increasingly bigger hit per member. Okay, so club dues, you mean like that annual sort of due? Actually, there has been some questions about that. I think I'll get into that in a few slides. And so if I don't address it, then we can come circle back. Okay. Would the committee reconsider increases in the seat fee separately? If the seat fee increased by $1 to $5, not a meaningful amount, it would deliver $47K in revenue. Derek, do you want to address that one?
So just to be, where did that come from? I don't see it on my chat. I just want to speak to whoever asked it.
Oh, Tracy.
So
It's me, Derek.
yeah, okay. No, I didn't know who I was
I
talking.
pay a lot of seat fees. That's why I'm asking.
I'm sorry?
I pay a lot of seat fees. That's why I'm
Gotcha.
asking.
So I want to make sure, so are you suggesting that we do a are you suggesting we do a $5 seat fee and not raise any of the others for the same essentially?
No,
No.
no,
Okay.
I know you said, I was actually typing my question when you said that you decided as a group to consider all of the increases, like 5 across the board, 6 across the
Oh.
board, 7 across the board. And
Okay.
so my question is, would you reconsider on the seat fee? Because it's a bit different, right? That's paid by every Rowing Canada member for the regattas that they go to. It doesn't cost the clubs anything. It costs the members. Like, I mean, I pay when I register for regatta, I pay seat fee, click, and it goes into my charge that I pay to participate in a regatta. And an increase from $4 to $5 for a seat fee doesn't feel that meaningful to me as a competitor who frequently participates in more than one event at a regatta. So it was just a question of, would the committee reconsider that, given that it could be, it could be a meaningful increase in the total revenue from here.
I would certainly consider that.
Well, it's a question for the committee, so it doesn't have to
course.
be answered today.
Yes.
But it was just a question, given that it's not a club charge, it's really something that the individual competitors who choose to race would be paying.
Right. Got it. Okay. No, thank you for that. I mean, I can tell you that at the risk of repeating something said earlier in this evening, and if I'm repeating, I apologize. Part of our process is to kind of get feedback tonight and kind of a gut check or a sense check. And the committee will be definitely meeting at least once more before we finalize our recommendation. So I think it's fair to say that the committee will listen to and consider anything that's brought up tonight. That doesn't mean the committee will change the recommendation, but that's part of the process tonight.
Yeah, because I would just say that a seat fee of, $4.28 is, we don't have pennies anymore in Canada even. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to do it. It's the least expensive component in this thing. And I just wanted to see if it would be worth discussing again. So thanks for the conversation.
No, fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, next up, Appreciating RCA has committed to the development of a long-term financial strategy in 2025. would it not be more appropriate to make any increase over CPI, so 5% this year, as a one-year levy to be reviewed after the long-term financial strategy is completed next year? Otherwise, your membership will be paying for the 5% increase compounded annually forever. Do you want to take that one, Derek?
I mean, that was from Peter, right?
Yes.
Um, I mean, I think my answer, Peter, would more or less be the same as similar to what I just said to Tracy, in that the committee can consider that for sure. If I'm understanding your point, just keep it at the 5 or recommending a 5% increase instead of a 7. Accept that for a year until we've done that longer term strategy. Because you're right, I've said that, I've said it repeatedly, and we've published that. No question, no question. I think the only additional piece I would say to that, and then please feel free to respond, Peter, is that the one thing I personally strongly believe in, and it's a decision of the committee, not mine, and I'm not a voting member of the committee, by the way, I'm ex officio, is that Rowing Canada needs to do increases every year in a stair-step model, whatever they are, as opposed to trying to hold too low, and then do a whammy in 3 years. That I've seen that happen, and I really want to avoid that. And the other piece, as we talk about the percentage increases, and some may say, well, you're over CPI, which is be true. And some would argue significant, others not so much on a percentage basis. The thing I'd say to that, and I made this point to the committee in our discussions, is our base is, relatively speaking, our base is so low. When you're starting from a low base, and an unreasonably low base, then low increases just perpetuate that problem, right? We'll never get caught up or to where we probably should be as far as a membership contribution to overall operations. So it is a balancing act, no question. And this is why we go through this process and engage the membership to kind of try and be as reasonable and as fair, and kind of what will the market bear without, that's keeping us moving forward without completely disrupting the system. So I hope I've kind of addressed what you've asked, Peter. It's a fair question, and it's another approach. So, go ahead, Jen.
Okay. Okay, next on is Jen. You mentioned that RC has reduced the staff count. Can the organization function properly with the current staffing level? Are current staff overloaded? Have you conducted a risk assessment regarding this? Okay, so there's a few questions there. No, I don't think the organization can function well with the current levels, and we did start the assessment of this in the summer. I do anticipate that we'll know more and be able to sort of like right size the org structure in the coming months. Staff are definitely overloaded. They have been since before the pandemic and continue to be. And it's really draining because there's a lot of work that we know that the community wants to do and that we want to do. You get people who work at Rowing Canada because they love rowing. And just really challenged to actually do the sort of like above and beyond, right? Like the special projects that there's definitely no void of good ideas and things that we can work on, but we're just trying to get from breakfast to lunch and lunch to dinner, based on what we currently can because of the financial constraints. Okay, next is you gave a breakdown of domestic investment and benefits. Are you giving one for high performance? No, not today. So the high performance funding is, I'll repeat some of what I spoke to earlier. So that funding is from our performance partners. So on the podium have quite rigid expectations on how and what we use that funding for. And it's not really something that the membership does weigh in on. So I think I'll just leave it at that, unless you want to get into it more. I can give you more details on that. Will we get a copy of the slides? I cannot see any of the slides. Yep, there will be, the PowerPoint will be published on the website, and also there'll be a recording of the whole webinar that will be also posted to the website. Okay, will there ever be a time when RCA will entertain another model for regatta participation? Some of us have been asking for many years now about a model where people who row on their own, not everyone needs or wants to row with a club, can enter a regatta without being a member of a club. Club fees can be prohibitive. This potential model of regatta participation particularly applies to coastal events and would allow more people to participate in regattas. Some events may be at risk of not happening due to limited participation. So the answer is yes, and RCA did entertain another model for regatta participation several years ago. Some of you may be familiar with this. It was when RCA put forward the concept of like a racing license, and the membership voted it down. So that doesn't mean that that's where we have to stay with that model, but just to respond to the earlier part of that question. So yes, RCA does entertain that. And then recently we have started to explore like what could that look like specific to Janice's question here around coastal. We do think that there's an opportunity here to explore other models that would enable people to come who aren't necessarily like registered within our current registration systems and enjoy participating at an event. I think I'll also remind people that we do have something like that already in place for indoor. Okay, so again, as part of the membership model, at that time, we were really keen to grow the sport of indoor rowing. And so what we put in place there from a registration system was that you would still pay a seat fee, but you don't have to be a member of a Rowing Canada Avedon membered organization to participate in a Rowing Canada Avedon sanctioned event. Okay, just as an example, it's because we wanted people who represent, say, a CrossFit club, that they would then be able to attend an indoor event without having to pay full-on membership. They would still pay a seat fee. And so that's just one example of like an alternative avenue or approach that we could look to mimic. But what I will also say related to that is indoor versus coastal, completely different like risk profile, right? A lot less risk associated with indoor rowing than there is on the water. So there's a bit more work we need to noodle through to figure out how to make that work. But I think it's really very realistic. Actually, just earlier this week, we were in conversation about what the future of like coastal, specifically beach, can look like. And we did speak to, I anticipate we were going to be piloting some of these different like registration models, possibly as early as this summer. So sorry, that's a long way of answering your question, but hopefully that's some detail that you're looking for. Okay, somebody here says, a seat fee would reflect a user pays approach to racing fees. Yes, definitely the seat fee was early days. It was characterized as a pay as you play sort of model. Okay. Next comment, I am pleading for a reasonable fee for kids in day camps. Currently, they must pay the full membership. They can row for a max of 8 weeks, but in reality, most often 1 or 2 weeks in the summer. With the current increase, it is a serious deterrent to enrollment in rowing day camps. Okay, I think I'll get into a little bit of that short-term programming when I get to a few slides from now. Okay. Another comment, it does cost some clubs, depends on the structure of the program. I don't know what that's in relation to. Oh, seat fees, okay. What is the current cost of the Regatta Central contract? Are the RCA seat fees primarily used to fund this? I recall from the 2019 RCA paper that it was expected to be in the range of 150 to 200K. I'm not sure exactly how that works or where it is now. Thanks for putting this all together. I don't have that detail in front of me. So what should I mention that I know to be true? So we pay a fee to Regatta Central for every seat in the same way that anyone who competes pays to RCA a fee for a seat. It's less than what the seat fee is from what we pay to Regatta Central. I don't have the number off the top of my head. Sorry. Okay. Roberto says increasing club and member fees is not going to fix the staffing issue. No, it probably won't. And I think maybe as we move on in the webinar, maybe before we wrap up, I'll circulate a bit of a paper that was developed by the Canadian Olympic Committee and the Canadian Paralympic Committee about the state of national sport federations all across Canada that might be of interest to you. And it came forward with an ask to the federal government for an increase of at least $104 million, which is the current deficit across all the NSOs right now. Much of that has to do with the fact that the core funding or the reference level funding has not increased since 2005. And to Roberta's point here, there's no way that gap is going to be filled by registration or membership fees from local community sport. That's just not realistic. And so there is a lot of advocacy right now to the federal government about putting more money into community sport. Okay. Another question here. Did the committee discuss and or factor the impact of an increase of 5% over CPI on how PRAs may or can implement possible fee increases, as we are also seeing decrease in funding and zero increases over the past 10 years, I think. Derek, did you want to take that one? Or Dr.
Sorry, can you repeat that? That was a little fast for me.
Oh, sorry, I know. Okay, did the committee discuss or factor the impact of an increase of 5% over CPI on how PRAs may implement possible fee increases, as we were also seeing decreases in funding and zero increases over the post 10 years?
Yes, okay, got it. So yes, the committee did discuss, absolutely. It came up from probably all of the provincial, I'll call them provincial reps or regional reps, I guess is the proper term, to the committee that in a lot of cases, the provinces also have, if not all, have some form of member registration fee. In some cases, I know certainly Ontario, there's both the base fee and a seat fee, in addition to the RCA fees and so on. But we did not factor what a provincial fee change might be as we work through what our recommendation might be for the Rowing Canada fee. We really focused on and the mandate of this committee is to focus on what does Rowing Canada need to meet its obligations, and what's reasonable and fair. And we did not try to factor a provincial fee may change to X or Y, nor did we try to factor in club fees may go up or down, because the scope, the variance of club fees from the very lowest end of the spectrum to the very highest end of the spectrum it's very, very broad. And different clubs apply their fee modeling in very different ways. There's no tit for tat for tot to match that. Same as for the provinces. So it was discussed. It definitely came up, but it was not a bearing factor in this recommendation.
I think also, just to note, some of the provinces are actually ahead of us for fee increases. It doesn't mean that we can't do that type of modeling that's like being asked about here, and philosophically having more of a perspective on that. But we understand that there's only so much wiggle room, and that if one entity goes and kind of scoops it all up, that can be problematic. But I did just want to flag that, yeah, the timing of it depends on what province you're coming from, right? Some provinces set their fees and their fee increases before Rowing Canada presents theirs to the membership. Okay, what is being done to find other sources of funding, sponsorships, etc.? There's been several attempts at securing different types of sponsorships. One thing I will say is that within the Canadian sport landscape, that this concept of sport sponsorship has been it's decreasing. Those opportunities are not there like they used to be. The COC has been incredibly successful. Some think that the COC has really scooped up a lot of the opportunities. But again, I want to remind everyone that we do still benefit from the COC. But it has had an impact on sort of access to sponsors that are interested in supporting sport. Even just more recently, the Coach Association in Canada hosts the Sport Leadership Conference, which is when leaders in the national sports sector come together and they celebrate sport, and there's lots of learning that takes place. And historically, I can't remember how, it's been so long now, that's been the Petro-Canada Sport Leadership Conference, and Petro-Canada, this is the last year that they have sponsored it. They had to step away from that partnership, and now which means that's the last year of Sport Leadership Conference. So the pain points that we're experiencing at RCA are found all across the system. Okay. Somebody says, as a regatta organizer, I disagree with a $1 increase. It does put the other pressures on the system. And some provinces also have seat fees on top. Okay, and then to compete in BC, that would be $8.50 per event per person. Okay. Okay, some of these are just comments. So I look forward to learning more about piloting of another way of allowing people to race in coastal. Will this be shared with membership, in particular coastal clubs? Yes. Appreciating our CA is committed to the development of a long-term financial strategy in 25. Oh, I think this is a repeat of a question I've already addressed. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Let's keep going through our slides now, everyone, unless anyone has any other questions you want to address with the content that's on this page. I think we're going to get close to start wrapping up. Okay, Daphne, it's over to you.
So we discussed a bit of that already, so what was suggested and the recommendation currently of the committee for fees and dues was the dues and fee. Yeah, the dues and fee committee recommends an increase of approximately 7% to the base participant fee, going from $27.50 to $29.40, and seat fee going for $4 to $4.30. Sorry, $4.30, which while it insufficiently, to fully keep up with increasing costs, is intended to limit their impact in a short term. Dues and fees committee also recommend an increase of approximately 7% in club membership dues, going $4.60 to $4.90. Special association and associated organization dues, $5.75 to $6.15, and provincial rowing association dues going to $800 to $8.55. Going in French now, la recommandation du comité des cotisations est d'aller pour une augmentation d'environ 7% des frais de participation, passant de $27,50 à $29,40. Aussi pour les frais d'inscription aux régates, passant de $4 à $4,30. Qui, bien qu'insuffisante pour entièrement suivre l'augmentation des coûts, a pour but de limiter les conséquences à court terme. Le comité des cotisations et des frais recommande également une augmentation d'environ 7% à la cotisation des clubs, passant de $460 à $490. Une augmentation des associations spéciales organisations associées, passant de 575 à 615, et finalement des associations provinciales d'aviron, passant donc de $800 à $855. Évidemment, tous les montants ont été arrondis pour simplifier la planification et la comptabilité. Merci pour vos questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Daphne. Okay, let's see, two more. Okay, special associations, what are they? Could they have a larger increase? And I like the club model based on the number of members, helps new clubs grow. Okay, so Henley is an example of a special association, or Cascadia Regatta Association. So they are organizations that are at the local level primarily that don't actually have rowers registered with them. Okay, so they don't have participants. Oh, thanks, Judy. Good example. Yeah, Dominion Day Regatta Association. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So additional topics that have come up as part of the dues and fees process that don't fall within the mandate of the dues and fees committee, but obviously have some relevance. And some of these have come up over the past couple of years, not exclusively during this year. So I wanted to give an update on some of the work that's being done with that short-term or inclusion programming registration, because one of the feedback and learnings that we get as part of the Community Sport for All initiative program is that our sort of rigid registration systems aren't really fit for purpose for that type of programming. Additionally, we've heard that the membership wants to explore like what, a different sort of mechanism or approach to short-term programs. Now, short-term, depending on who you speak to, differs. So that's obviously something that we need to unpack as a community together. What do we really mean by that? But just as an update, so we have been working and we're successful in getting some funding secured to do this work, because just anticipating sort of where we could be headed with this. It'll go beyond the sort of typical sort of like maintenance of a registration system, right? This is a bigger project and it's going to come with a price tag for us to really activate anything. If we were to add like something new and say the web registration system for people to register, that aligns with what we've heard from the community. And so we're really better positioned now than we were a year ago to be able to commit to doing that work. And so I wanted to share that with the community tonight. And then we're working on the scope of work. Like I mentioned earlier, like what does short term really mean? We got to figure out how to put some, how to characterize that. And that'll give us some guidance. And also working alongside with leaders of the Community Sport for All program, that'll give us really valuable insights of what type of sort of like registration approach would be the best fit for those community groups. Anticipate that we're going to collect more wider member feedback on where we're heading with this in the spring of 2025. So we are starting now to pull together some individuals, mostly people who are representative of provincial rowing associations, and also a handful of people who've been really hands-on with Community Sport for All programming. And then in the spring 2025, we'll come forward to the wider membership with sort of what we're learning or what we think we need to pilot and if we need to gather more feedback from the wider membership. And then dovetailing with that is this concept of like scalable membership dues, right? That small, medium to large. There's a lot of like philosophical differences on that topic. We hear often here during the webinar that people want us to consider small or a different suite of dues for smaller clubs. But then we also hear that the larger clubs feel like they actually already do pay a lot to Rowing Canada. They are the ones who are giving a lot of funding through the participant fees. And so we definitely have some work to do there, but I think we'll do a bit of a sort of a touch point with the membership at the same time that we do this member feedback on these new registration mechanisms to see really where people's heads are at on this topic and get a sense of how far we want to lean into it. And so that'll be the first time that in many, many years, at least over a decade, I think that we've really sort of formally touched base with the membership on that topic. Okay. Next steps related to dues and the fees committee. So I think Daphne mentioned this already, but there's a bit more work to do. We're convening tomorrow. We're just going to take any of the comments and learnings that we have from tonight, and ultimately that'll be incorporated into the recommendation that the dues and fees committee will present to the board of directors. And then the next time that we're going to touch base with the membership is during the pre-semi-annual meeting plenary. So that is a session that we host the day before the semi-annual meeting. So if people have additional questions, they can ask them then, but you will have received the materials the 21 days before the semi-annual meeting at that point. And then we will do voting on the topic of dues and fees at the semi-annual meeting, which is scheduled for January 26, 2025. Okay. Okay, we have some more questions here. Okay. Please keep in mind that larger clubs have larger expenses that are proportional to their membership, larger fee, higher insurance, more coaches and staff. Yeah, so that's the sort of feedback that we've heard too. So that's the sort of thing that we really need to unpack. Like, where does the whole membership sit on this topic? And so I think that it's realistic that we'll get some valuable feedback when we touch base in the spring. Okay. Kids already register with RCA. I have been asking for several years to come up with a solution, so it means that for this year again, we have to charge $29.40 for kids for 5 mornings of rowing. I know it definitely takes a lot of work for us to sort of unpack the membership model, but I feel good. There's enough data here that we're going to be able to make some good progress in a short term. And I also think that the concept of piloting some models before we like unravel the whole membership system, like we can get a lot of learning by testing things out, that I think it's realistic we can do some of that as early as this year. And so Paul, maybe like your club will be one that actually puts its hand up to be a pilot, and we'll get a lot of learning from your experience with that. And then we'll, be closer to be able to make more permanent changes. Okay. Next question is excited to hear movement on updated membership fee model, as RCA and PRAs would realistically need to be in general harmony for any changes to be effective and meaningful. Oh, yes. So, and that is what we've signaled to the PRAs, so the people who are going to join us in like scoping out some of this work will have a really deep understanding of a few things. So how the community type programs exist within their province at the local clubs, but then additionally, the business rules, right? So there most certainly will be sort of like trickle down effect if Rowing Canada makes some shifts in certain areas that we'd be looking for PRAs to follow suit if it makes sense for the province. Okay, reseat fees. There are many programs where athletes don't pay the seat fee themselves, but through their clubs. For example, university, schools, and youth programs. This may result in coaches actually reducing the number of races they enter to save money. Yep. Okay. Curious how the lone medal from Olympics and rowing will impact high performance funding, which will then impact RCA overall. Yeah, we're not there yet. We're, finding ourselves in review season, but I also know that it's very forward thinking, right? And so we'll see. We'll see what comes up of on the podium reviews. And on the podium is also making changes to the review process. So we're actually right now just in dialogue about what 1 year looks like, and they're trying to give a bit of space for national sport federations that just came back from a busy summer in Paris at the Olympics and the Paralympics. And then we're anticipating in like 6 months or 12 months time, we'll be in conversations about what does funding look like for 4-year period. So we're just as curious as you are. Don't have much more of an answer to that right now. Oh, we have a hand up. Oh,
Yes.
Paul, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. I'm sorry. I must insist that we move with something for the kids. I've been asked, I wrote it, I've said it, but each year when I have to draw the program for the kids and publicize that, yes, insurance is there, but you have to pay almost $30 to get it for 5 mornings. It makes absolutely no sense. And we were told several years ago that there was a poll or there was a survey that was being done. I don't recall hearing much. Last year in Quebec City, there was some discussion. I did state that we need to have something in December for the programs to be published by March. And I understand that we're very short from there. It's not possible, but please consider to have something for this coming summer. It's not a lot to ask. I understand that everybody is very busy, but the impact when we try to recruit and have this sport discovered, the impact is huge. So I really, really plead for the kids.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Maybe I'll let Andrew speak first before. I don't know if Andrew's comment is related.
Yeah, it is actually. My comment is I empathize with those comments, and I've been an advocate of the same, and willing to put my hand up to help wherever I can to do that. But I will say though that it's not abnormal for NSOs to have fees associated with even small time programming. I paid $30 for my kid to get 10 hours of skating lessons, and I paid $30 to Skate Canada so my kid could do 10 one-week sessions, or 10 days, 10 sessions once a week, right? Like it's inevitable that those things happen. And when my wife complained about it, I said, shut up, that's how I get paid. So don't complain about those fees. So I justified it that way with her. But it happens. And I know it's high, but we have to figure out how to work within it. And I think Jen's mentioned that it's something that's on the radar, and I know we've been talking about it, but we're not alone. A lot of other sports do the same thing.
No, it's a challenge for all of Canadian sport right now. And so I mentioned earlier, I'll put some links in the chat. I'll do that once I stop screen sharing in a moment. And also an opportunity, actually, maybe an ask of you, the membership, to take a peek at something that's happening right now. It's called the Future of Sport. review. So there's an opportunity for you to give feedback directly to the federal government. There's several topics that they've identified. And the cost for kids and the struggles that parents deal with for getting their children into community sport is definitely a topic I know they're keen to hear more about. I actually met with the Future Sport Commission last week, and I asked them specifically, do you want feedback on the impact on youth, you know, from parents, from community leaders? And they said yes. And so I'll put that in the link or in the chat in a moment. Okay. Let me see here. Can you explain the reference level core breakdown 684.1 domestic versus 7.5? Sure. Let me go to that slide. Debbie, why don't you ask your question? You can take your phone off mute. What would you like to know?
I'm just curious, so what is encompassed in that? So just wondering, why is there $755,000 going to the high performance? Like, what is that for? And could it not be all dumped into the domestic to help with the fees?
Okay, no, it can't be dumped into domestic. So that is really clear and a directive that we have from Sport Canada. We are expected to put the portion into high performance programming. Most NSOs don't benefit from enhanced excellence. Okay, like we do get that benefit, but no, it is required. On the Podium will give us a bit of direction if we can decrease that amount, but this is a sort of amount that has been sort of expected from the performance partners and the government over the past several years. It fluctuates slightly, but definitely not in any material way. And as far as like, I think you asked something like what do we get for the 684? Is that what you were asking, Debbie?
Yeah, like what is it spent on?
Yeah, all of this whole slide. So when you add up these numbers here, so all of this is a combination of the membership dues and fees with the portion of the government funding that is allocated to national and domestic. Okay. And
Thank
then you obviously, it's a lot of information right now to digest. So we'll definitely have the slides posted on the website. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing now because I want to be able to find those links for all of you and also open it up. If anyone has any other questions you want to speak to, now would be a good time. We still have 7 minutes. So you're welcome if you want to speak, and if you're more comfortable using the chat function, go ahead. Maybe Derek and Daphne will keep an eye on that while I find some of these links I was referencing.
You bet, Peter. Thank you for your note.
Okay, and I'll just screen share too in a moment if that helps people get them oriented on what I'm referencing here. Okay, I'll do that because we have a few more moments. Just bear with me, everyone. Okay, so the first link that I put in the chat is this here. Okay, so it's a lengthy document, but it's incredibly comprehensive. And if you're a leader of a sport club, I encourage you to take a look at it. So this was funded by the Canadian Olympic Committee and the Canadian Paralympic Committee, and it was prior to when the federal budget would have been presented back in the spring. And so this gives a bit of history on some of what you've been hearing Rowing Canada speak to about the pressures that we're facing because of the lack of like an increase in federal funding over the past 2 decades. Okay, so there's a bit more detail there. And they did an assessment, or they did a survey or consultation with all the national sport federations. And as listed here, you can see that it's $104 million right now that effectively is missing to actually support just basic operations of NSOs. And so this is just related to like the core operations. It doesn't even include any sort of like innovative projects. Okay. The data is quite the way they presented it is quite startling. And so I encourage you to take a look at it. This report is available. It's in both English and French. I believe the French content is actually, it's in the same report. It's just at the bottom. And so this is worthwhile for you to get oriented on what's going on and the challenges that the whole sector is facing. Okay. Secondly, I want to bring your attention to this work. It's called the Future of Sport in Canada Commission. It's a review that's going on. It's funded by the federal government. And I think it's fair to say that most of it was actually prompted because of the issues related to safe sport that I know many of us have been working on over the past several years. But the government wants to have a deeper understanding of what works, what isn't working, and how we can all make improvements. And I will say that it is completely, this whole review and this commission is actually independent of Sport Canada, Department of Canadian Heritage. But you can find lots of background information on here if you wish. Okay. This is the area here, improving the sport system in Canada, including but not limited to policy, funding structures, governance, reporting, accountability, conflicts of interest, systems alignments, cultural and legal considerations. And so you could definitely lean in here about the challenges you're experiencing at your club related to the funding structures and the lack of funding. And you can even probably refer back to that report that the COC and the CPC pulled together. There's several different ways that you can share your experience and provide feedback. Some are written in person and some will be through a survey that I don't believe is yet open. So when you kind of cruise down the webpage, you'll see that you can take a survey. Let me just check. I don't think it's open yet. No, I know it's not open yet. I think that's going to open in January. You could also send in a letter to the commission and you can arrange to speak with them. So they're doing a bit of a cross-country tour right now. So if you find your location listed here, and I think they're keen to add more locations too. Oh yeah, it looks like Gatineau, Quebec was just added. So you can even arrange to speak with them in person if you wish. But just know that if survey is more your preferred option, that is going to open early 2025. And Rowing Canada, I think it's going out in our newsletter. And we'll make sure that we bring a lot of attention to this opportunity over the next couple of months so no one misses out. Okay. Oh, and I will put that link in the chat also. Okay. Okay, it looks like we have a few comments here. Okay. If you have a moment, what was the rowing license you said was discussed a decade or so ago? Yeah, it almost was a decade ago now that you say that. So there was a membership model review. So very, very long ago, we used to actually have two categories of membership. One was called sport and one was competitive. Sport was effectively like recreational rowers, and the competitive category was for people who went to an event or a regatta. There was no seat fee at that time. And there was lots of work done to look at different models with a license to compete. So you pay, I don't know, for 10 regattas at one sort of thing. There were a few concepts that were floated to the membership at that point along those lines, and they didn't get much traction. And we ultimately ended up with this sort of pay-as-you-play model and a simplified model where you have one membership category. And the deepest rationale, the one that had the most depth to it, was that keep things simple at the top, right? At the Rowing Canada level. As soon as you add more complexity at the Rowing Canada level, you actually make it a bit more complicated to align with at the provincial and then at the local level. I could probably dig up some of that background information. It was many years ago now, so I can't speak to many of the specifics, but I'm sure I can find a way to get it to you, Brent. But I do remember distinctly that was something that we explored. Okay. Appreciate the time and effort. Okay. Yeah, agreed. Some excellent points were raised for consideration of the committee and RCA. Okay. Okay. While I'm not opposed to an increase, I deeply appreciate the thoughtful consideration being given to exploring alternative funding models. I'm fully committed to supporting initiatives that help Coastal make meaningful progress and look forward to seeing how we can move forward together. It's a great comment. Okay. I think we're getting close to wrap up. I'm not seeing any more questions. And we have 1 minute left. So we're right on time. Daphne, Derek, do you have anything else to share before we start to wrap up?
Not for me, thank you.
Yeah, only thank you for everyone to being there tonight and sharing your comments and asking many of the questions the committee did ask. Glad that I see some questions that we do ask currently, so thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Really do appreciate your thoughtful questions and comments. It really reflects that you have a deep understanding yourself of what we have on the go here at RCA and also at your club and the PRA. We know this is a webinar, it's a 90-minute webinar. It takes a lot out of your day, but we do really digest your feedback. I know the committee will have a thoughtful discussion tomorrow when we convene again. So if you do have questions that come up that after you leave, don't forget you can email Daphne and Derek. You can also email me if you can't get a hold of them and I'll make sure that they got it. Oh, thanks, Suzanne. Suzanne just put their contact information in the chat. That's wonderful. Okay. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to seeing many of you when we come together again virtually in January.
Take care, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.